So hello everybody and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. It's brilliant to have all of you guys back, and with me today is Kay Formanek. So today we are going to be talking about diversity inclusion, and when it comes to diversity, Kay is a long time passionate supporter of that, and in fact she is not only a former Accenture managing director, but she's actually the author of an upcoming book called Leading Diversity with Purpose and Inclusion. So welcome, Kay. It's lovely to have you on the show.
It's wonderful to be here and so lovely to be speaking about this important topic.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Kay. So what is your journey, and has diversity always been a lifelong passion, or is it something that has sort of come to you on your journey and your travels?
Well, thank you for the question. Often I say to the students that I teach, I teach at a number of business schools, and, the organizations that I serve, that it wasn't so much that I chose diversity. I almost feel that diversity chose me. And I say that because of the journey. I was born to Austrian immigrants in South Africa at the time of apartheid. So, ever since my birth, we really have seen episodes such as Sharpeville and Soweto riots and the Rubicon speech. And it really does something to a child to be actually born in a country where you have legalized discrimination. And I thankfully was born in a family where my father and mother always asked my sister and myself to take a stand. What did we think about apartheid? And I was also very privileged to attend a boarding school, which was a multiracial boarding school. So on the one hand, you have legalized discrimination. On the other side, you're living sort of with a rainbow nation in a boarding school, and that is your family. And that really started the journey of thinking about diversity. Why do we discriminate? Why do we have bias? I was certainly enabled on my journey by my sister. She was born prematurely, and she would be classified as a person with disabilities. And I saw this incredible lawyer and poet who was so much the victim actually of bias. So that led me to a voyage also in my career of assuming D&I lead, writing about diversity, researching diversity.
So where do you think this lack of diversity come from? What is this sort of why do people discriminate? What drives that kind of behavior?
It's a wonderful question, because once one really understands the answer to that, one can start doing things and moving the needle. The reality is that each of us are born with this incredible brain that becomes hardwired during our life journey, and very much through the situations that we've been exposed, which in itself is impacted by society and our norms. And what occurs very, very early in our childhood is we start distinguishing between an in-group, people that we feel comfortable with, and an out-group. And this occurs very automatically, and in fact is part of our whole survival drive. Unfortunately, what occurs is that it becomes very unwitting, an unconscious bias, a preference to be with people that are people like ourselves, and it means that very unwittingly we start discriminating and keeping people on the outskirts of our group.
So that you said a really interesting comment there, which was people like us. So is the definition of people like us what actually leads to discrimination? So how people identify and how they see themselves?
Yes. What occurs is we look around our society, the people that we go to school with, the people that we are in a team with, and we start identifying the characteristics that connect us. And so anyone who doesn't meet that definition, we regard as an out-group. And what is so very interesting is that we tend to be more compassionate. We tend to be more interested to people that we identify with. So if you've lived in your whole life in a very protected way, or you've worked in an organization where there's been a very dominant homogeneous group. You try to fit in, and in fact, unwittingly, you keep other people out. We must not forget that in some societies, we do it quite deliberately. I spoke about South Africa. We had apartheid. It was a deliberate system to exclude people from opportunities. But what you'll see also is that there are countries where there is a class system, where we try to differentiate people who have education or not, people who are in the in-group or not. So it is very much something that plays for us personally, but also within our society. And we just have to be so mindful about that.
Yeah, because you talked a lot about unconscious bias versus conscious discrimination. So how often is discrimination unconscious versus a conscious approach?
It's a very interesting question. If you look at a continuum, there is a continuum of legalized discrimination. We talked about apartheid. Then you've got systems where there is systemic bias. Many people will say it's not conscious, but if you look at the laws, often we talk about the United States, the concept of redlining, which talked about giving loans dependent in terms of the postcode of the suburb that you lived. And if you didn't live there, you wouldn't get the loans, which in effect means that you can't settle where you wish to settle. But in countries such as the UK or the Netherlands, we also have these type of systemic norms. So, for example, in the Netherlands, it is a country that has a very low number of women working full-time in a work environment. And part of that is a sort of societal norm of what constitutes good motherhood. So, on the one side, you've got apartheid legalized, but then you have this more societal norms and values that excludes. And then you do have something that is very unconscious. When we mean unconscious, cognitively, you're not aware of it. It is something where there is a knee-jerk reaction. An example that you might know is the Boston Symphony Orchestra, where they wish to have more women within their orchestra. They weren't getting these women. And so what they were doing is to say, let us have blind auditions. So we have no unconscious bias. They didn't see an impact. And then they realized that there was a clickety-clack of stiletto heels that led to a sensory attention point that, oh, this is a woman auditioning, and would trigger an unconscious bias that maybe men are more proficient in an orchestra. So what happens is that at the point that you're starting to understand where these biases might occur, you can actually mitigate them. So we've got this whole continuum, and indeed, a great deal is unconscious. And in our society of social media, what you're seeing is that we're talking about it more, and you certainly see younger people are less biased than the older generations because they're more aware of it.
And I guess the question is what is the importance to organizations and to corporates and to finance teams in specifically? What is the importance of addressing this diversity issue, whether it's conscious, systemic, or or unconscious? What are the elements that why do we actually need to address it in the first place?
There are so many reasons to be addressing this. I am delighted to see that organizations, whether they're profit or non-profit, are starting to look at diversity, not as a nice to have, not only because of the legal requirements of not having class actions or facing quota issues if you're within Europe, but there is a sense that diversity creates performance. There is a business case. But equally, with recognition to our younger millennials and our Generation Z, these are our youth of today under 22 who are going to be going into the marketplace. This authenticity, the advancement of equity, diversity is very important for feeling at home. And so for leaders, they're starting to recognize that in order to have their longevity, their agility, to be able to attract people, they're going to have to take diversity very seriously. The problem, and to your question, is that if you have the commitment to do that, but you are unaware that unwittingly you're keeping out that diversity because there are talent blind spots and biases, then there is an issue. And this is why there is so much attention on the area of unconscious bias.
So if we just take a pause and actually, what do we mean by diversity? Because we've talked a lot about obviously class, about you mentioned obviously your sister. So talk to us about how wide is diversity? What does it include? What are the different diverse groups that we need to be either conscious of or thinking about when we're understanding this bias piece?
I believe that one of the most helpful models is actually a model by Rowe, and I name it because many people think that diversity is what we call inherited demographics, inherited characteristics. And that indeed we talk about age and gender and ethnicity and race and ability, etc. And I can understand why people defined it as such, because if you look at the Constitution of the United States, Chapter 7, they just said, thou shalt not discriminate on the basis of all these inherited characteristics. What we're recognizing, however, as we're really looking at the lens of diversity, is that it's a factor of more layers. One is your inherited demographics, your characteristics. But then it can be also your acquired characteristics. Where did I live? What cultures am I aware of? What education did I have? What is my specialization? Am I a mother or not? Etc., etc. And diversity also comes from the organization that you've had the privilege for working. So there are many organizations that say we want to have diversity of organizational experience. And last but not least, we need to recognize that each person is diverse in a unique way in terms of their values, their beliefs, their likes, dislikes. So diversity is the bundle of inherited characteristics, acquired, organizational, and what we would call the personality dimensions.
I love that. I guess that also poses some challenges though, doesn't it? Because we're broadening it out from measurable, necessarily sort of inherited characteristics that might be tracked into a much broader range around your working history, where you've come from, your current, whether you're a mother, whether you're a father, and how that impacts on you as an individual. So how do we understand the diversity of our teams? Is there a way to measure how diverse we are as a workforce?
Such an important question, and it leads me to highlight that when you're talking about diversity and what dimensions you wish and how you're going to measure it, that fundamentally you need to start by being clear about why you need diversity. In the book Beyond D&I, Leading Diversity with Purpose and Inclusiveness, what I talk about is the strategic narrative for diversity. So if, for example, you're a consumer goods organization and you say that diversity is important for us because we wish to have better customer congruence, that means we wish to better understand our customers so we can serve them. And we're wanting diversity because we know that through diversity and inclusion, people have more engagement, loyalty, they're being more creative in the development of products and services. Well, then that's clear. And an organization needs to say that we are looking at diversity because of these reasons. Having said that, you are better able to identify the dimensions of diversity that you need to. So if, for example, I have a customer group that is from very different ethnicities and cultures, that potentially 80% of the consumers are women with children, well, then obviously my people that I'm going to be attracting need to resonate with my customer group. On the other hand, if your intent is, and I talk about the Central Bank of Ireland as a good case study, if you say our mandate is to manage risk on behalf of our citizens, and in order to do that, we need different specializations so we can anticipate financial risk and respond to it, then perhaps what you're trying to do is ensure that the dimensions of multiplicity of being able to look at financial risk is present, and you don't have a very dominant educational paradigm that doesn't allow you to see that risk. So it is very important to start by why are we doing it? What type of dimensions do we need? And then you can measure. So for the consumer goods, how would you measure that you have diversity? Well, it is the feedback from your customers that you've anticipated their requirements and that there is a congruence. And there are many ways of measuring that. For the central bank, it would be what is our ability to anticipate risk. And obviously in 2008, they were not able to, but they're in a better place to do so. So it becomes very strategic. I often speak that diversity is about the mind, the heart, the will, and it is an art and a science. We need to start looking at diversity in a business way, in a scientific way, and we need to treat it more strategically.
So what you talked about there was very much the strategic outcomes of focusing on diversity, about measuring sort of the impact that diversity has had on the business. But obviously to get into that place, you have to measure your progress with implementing a diversity policy. So how would you firstly assess your current position? You know, what are the leading and maybe lag metrics that you need to be aware of in terms of measuring your diversity?
Wonderful. So it starts by understanding that when you're measuring diversity, that there are 5 elements that lead to that diversity performance. We've spoken about diversity dimensions. We've also spoken about inclusion. Inclusion is a psychological safety. What is the point of inviting diversity in if the diversity can't show the perspectives because it feels unsafe to do so? But it also requires equity. We spoke a lot about bias. Equity is about fairness. It's access to resources. It's access to sponsorship. So you need to advance that fairness, equity. But very importantly, you need the purpose that we were talking about and the leadership, the inclusive leadership. We have found that 70% of people's feeling of being in an inclusive environment is directly related to how leaders behave. So those are the 5 elements. So to your question, how do you measure? The first is that you need to understand where you're going, and that leads to what we define as a stage of diversity that is important. There are 5 stages. The first stage is organizations that are just wanting to support the legal prerequisites or requirements. The second one are organizations who want to not be penalized by their stakeholders, employees or their customers. The third one is the one who wants to get performance out of diversity. The fourth is one who wants to use diversity to facilitate transformation. And the last, for example, like a Unilever, looks at diversity as a strategic anchor for advancing societal value. So once the organization is clear about why is it doing diversity and what stage it needs to get to, then there is a possibility to assess you against those 5 elements that I mentioned. And so to your point, how do I measure? You need to understand at what level do you need your diversity, your inclusion, your equity, your inclusive leadership, the type of purpose in order to satisfy that imperative. And there are methods to be measuring that, and these are explained.
So I guess if we think about then the journey that we might go on, it sounds like there is firstly, like you say, a clarity of purpose. So why are we actually implementing this diversity policy in the first place? What are we looking to achieve and how are we going to measure that? The second is then an assessment of where are we at? So in terms of, so how do we then, the next question we'll ask you is how do we fill that gap? How do we shift from actually, firstly, having identified that there is a diversity bias of some kind, whether that's systemic, whether that's demographic, etc., to actually getting to a point where that diversity is in place and managed. So what are some of the, I guess, the policies, the processes that we can go through to enable either our teams, our HR to actually support that journey?
So I think you've summarized it very well. It starts with where are we going and why do we need diversity? And as you said, it's then having a sense of where are we now? What is the gap? It is about closing the gap. And in fact, what all the research that has been done is suggesting that there are 6 things that need to be done in order to close the gap. The first one we spoke extensively about, but it is in terms of mitigating bias. And that means for the diversity journey that I'm on and for the dimensions of diversity that need to be in place, what are the most critical talent blind spots that are creating a barrier to get the diversity and retain the diversity? And it is always contextual because every organization will not only need to think about their journey, but the context in which they're living, because that society will also have the specific systemic biases. The second one is translating the diversity purpose to clear goals, which says, this is what we want to achieve. These are the investments that we're going to make. How do we know that we're going to get that return? And I say it because if you, for example, even look at a territory like United States, they spend $8 billion on forging diversity journeys. And many people say that perhaps as much as 80% is not seen to be translating to real benefits. So it's really building the case of what are our strategic goals? What investments are we going to do? Are they the right initiatives? How do we measure success? Then it is about embedding behavior. Once we know that leaders need to walk the talk and have a 70% impact on inclusion, which is so important, we need to define what is inclusive leadership. What are the values, the rituals, the daily practices that are going to create a bedrock for diversity to thrive? The next point, and the fourth one, is what we call putting the policies in place. My research has shown that, in fact, policies are usually top-down and usually by leaders who are not in the minority groups. So there is a huge gap in the policies that are being instigated versus appreciated as creating value. And what research has shown is that, for example, a very simple policy, zero tolerance in discrimination, if it's put out there and in fact managed and made to apply, is a very important policy. Then you need to in fact measure and monitor what you've been talking. What are the KPIs, the key performance indicators? What are the stretch goals? How are we going to measure it? And making it available, but also, especially for leadership, creating an incentive that they are directly accountable for those. And then last but not least, and the sixth capability is to celebrate and sustain. Diversity journeys are not easy. They're never completed. It's not a project with an end. And you need to celebrate achievements. Otherwise, you will become just too weary.
So in terms of diversity programs, you mentioned a really interesting statistic about how 80% of diversity programs or spend may not even be driving impact, which is slightly scary as well as quite interesting. So what are some of the initiatives that you have seen put in place that have driven impact? What made those work? And can you share some examples of stories with us?
Yes. There's been some wonderful research actually by BCG that I drew on and extended, and they effectively looked at something like 40 different policies that are being put in place, and also initiatives. And the success starts by being very methodical about what dimensions of diversity are you inviting in and what constitutes value. And what is interesting, we tend to cluster diversity as a sort of mass group. Well, when you really look into the dimensions of diversity, different dimensions might value different initiatives and policies different. So, for example, what we've seen is people of color are very anxious about bias that occurs in terms of the recruiting process. So any policies to mitigate bias at time of recruitment are important. What do I mean? It means that there are clear criteria, no open questions that are usually seen as very conducive to stimulating bias, that there's not only one person on the panel to recruit, but that there is a jury of recruiters who each evaluate, that people are not being looked at in terms of the school, their hobbies, but are in fact being looked in terms of their competency. So those initiatives are very important for people who are at the brunt side of unconscious bias. If you look at many women, especially with children, the flexibility, initiatives to encourage flexibility at work, a hybrid way of working, being mindful that you don't have drinks after work on a Friday, which is the only networking environment, are very important. What we see within the LGBTQ plus community, that organizations are out there and endorsing the community and the importance, and are part of key celebratory events. That is important. Now, what I don't want to do is create a stereotype of which policies apply, because what we've just said, diversity, is that each person is unique, and I may like one or more of these policies. But what I'm saying is that there needs to be an attention to detail. And often organizations can go out to the resource groups or the diversity communities and say, we are considering these. Are they valuable? Or can you please suggest to us something that would be very valuable to you in terms of building your belonging and your sense of inclusion and purpose within our organization? So don't do it top down. Invite to get some input.
I think that's a really interesting point about going out for ideas as well, because sometimes as a leader, you think you know that the answer in terms of new policies, but actually, like you say, it can be driven by some unconscious requirements. And I must admit, it's quite interesting, some of the comments you made around hobbies, because I never even considered that could be an unconscious bias piece on things like applications. So that's a really interesting point. So
if you don't mind me,
yeah.
just on the hobbies, there are these incredible studies which actually showed that there was a resume, a fictitious resume that was written, and it was directed at law firms. And on one of the set of resumes, it said that the person played polo. And on the other set of resumes, identical resume, it said that they had a bursary for running from a university. So clearly, what someone could look at is anticipate that the person with the polo came from perhaps a society or family that was well-meaned, wealthy, well-connected, and the other one really needed a bursary. And what they saw is that, in fact, there was a huge preference for the person with the polo. And this is why often I say, be very careful about asking these type of things. They create a bias, they create stereotypes, and you overlook the essence of the person coming in.
That is a really interesting thinking point around. So let's just focus down on the recruitment piece, because it all starts, with how do you get a diverse range of people into your organization. We could talk a little bit about, obviously, inclusivity as part of the leadership function, but what are some of what other examples can you share with us of where either unconscious or bias might come through in terms of recruitment? Your piece around seeing the person is quite an interesting comment.
Yes. So what we know is that there are a number of biases that are triggered at the time of recruiting. And if you don't mind me also mentioning, even before recruiting, I did research for a country in Europe who were trying to evaluate why not more women were going into STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths. And they saw that a lot of the students had done masters in science, technology, and yet at the time of recruitment, they didn't go into that area where they had done masters, but they jumped and they were interested. And it actually came right at the moment that the profile was released. We see that often the profile is written in very masculine terms. And for many of the women students, it didn't appeal to them. At the moment that you talk about, we need someone to drive a performance, to achieve results, to lead a team, etc. It's quite intimidating. And often what we see is that our younger generation, and also very particularly for women in this country, they wanted to be appealed as to be collaborating with a team, to achieve results together, leading with purpose. So the very way of writing the profile made them think, this is not for me. But at a time of recruiting, as I said, there is a huge bias in terms of name. So this is why sometimes the surname is dropped. We tend in Western societies like names that are Anglo-Saxon Western, like Jennifer Brown or John Brown. And so a name is very important. What we see is, and there's this very interesting experiment which was done where it was possible to glean that there was a person of color or a person who was Caucasian. Now, we're not allowed to measure that, but you could see it within the resume. You see, unfortunately, a callback for people who are identified as Western Caucasian being higher than those who are identified as being people of color. You see that there is a bias to beauty, how you look, how tall you are, etc. We see that there is a bias in Western societies. When we look at someone, we want someone to look in our eyes. We often say, eyes are the window to the soul, but there are many cultures as a sign of respect that lower their head and their eyes, not to show that they're disrespectful, but as a sign of respect. So all of these things need to be identified. And we need to say, for the diversity dimension that we're looking for, which of these triggers are we aware of and how do we take them out? And so the recruiting area is critical.
That is genuinely fascinating, because actually you can quite easily understand, having listened to some of the examples that you talk about, how easy it is for unconscious bias to feed into the recruitment process. So, are there success metrics? Obviously, you mentioned in terms of hiding names, obviously, when identifying CVs, obviously changing some of the questions that you're looking at. Is there a piece around doing blind interviews, so phone-based interviews versus video? Are there any other tips or tricks you can give to our listeners about how they can try and address the bias that they're unconsciously implementing?
Thank you. First of all, there is, when I talk about just the profiles, what is very important is that there is software that can immediately give an index of the type of feminine, masculine language in job profiles. Secondly, if we're doing recruiting, indeed, what we see given that height, it plays such a role. Also, the way that you're dressed. Simply doing a video conference is a way of mitigating, that whole picture, and coming into the room. So you already are able to give a little bit of a fairer chance. As I mentioned, in terms of the panel, really to focus on the competency. So in a situation like this that could occur, what would you do? How would you deal with the situation? The other thing that I think is quite important is giving a template, how you would want the resume to be done. What we'll see is that sometimes the leading universities, and I see it because I'm part of the universities, they give all the counseling of the perfect resume to deliver. Sometimes you want to create a level playing field for that you're saying in your resume, we want to ask you to answer these questions. So these are some various opportunities that can be done. Yes.
And I love that idea. So I'm a real passionate believer in building career paths particularly for young people. And one of the things that I have noticed is the quality of CVs across the board. And I love that idea. So for any of our junior roles, I certainly will be implementing CV templates. That's a fantastic way to put that forwards, because yes, if they've got good parents that have done CVs before, they might understand, well, good is, for parents that have been in the world of work and might understand how it should be formatted. They might not have that advice from somewhere else. So I think we could probably talk about recruitment processes for the rest of this podcast, but I want to shift very quickly on to a comment you made earlier around inclusive leadership. So assuming we've got our recruitment right, that we have we're enabling diversity within our recruitment processes, how do we ensure that we are providing a level of leadership that makes that person feel safe and feel welcomed into the environment? What are some of the things that we need to watch out for once they're on board and within the workplace?
Wonderful. Once again, what you'll sense in my reply is I always start with the definition, because I believe that how you define is how you lead. And so I start with leaders when we're talking about inclusive leadership and their responsibility by asking a very simple question. Do you even know what it means to have an inclusive environment? And they usually say, yes, it probably means that there is a sense of belonging and there is a sense of safety. And I indeed build on that and share the research. If you look at what people are saying, they're saying, I feel that I am part of a team. I feel that I can bring myself to work. I feel like I can trust my leader. I feel like that my work contributes to some purpose. So these are all things about inclusive. I then say to leaders, be mindful that your behavior has an impact of 70% on that inclusively environment. And then I say, do you know what it takes to be inclusive leader? Because it starts with the self. And there is some wonderful research that has been done which talks about the 6 traits of inclusive leaders. And it comes down that an inclusive leader is committed because they believe in the case for diversity and it resonates to their personal values. Number 2, they're courageous. What means that when they see a discriminatory practice or an unwitting bias, they say something every time. Not in a very dominant, judgmental way, but in a very humble way. What I see here, can we talk about it? I know it makes me feel uncomfortable, that type of wording. It's about curious. It is someone who is comfortable with ambiguity, and as a result is genuinely interested. Who are you? What do you think about, etc.? It is someone who's culturally intelligent, who has taken time to understand how different cultures are coming through. As someone who is collaborative and very important, cognizant of bias. And so as soon as we've got a mold, a mirror, to say to our leaders, these are things that are important for you to be seen as inclusive, and let's now help you be inclusive. And that means ensuring that these 6 C's that I've just said are there. 1, let's discuss the case for diversity and how you contribute. 2, let us allow you to regulate blind spots by teaching you about them and about your own unconscious bias. It is about cultural intelligence training. It is about helping leaders have courageous discussions. Many are committed, but just feel so uncomfortable saying something. It is about teaching leaders about deep listening, which is the window to being curious, not just listening with the mind, but with the heart, because that's when you see the person beyond the stereotype. So there are many things we need to do, and it takes organizational interventions, but I have never seen a person, a leader, become a good inclusive leader without wanting it personally, being committed to it personally.
I think that's a really great point, in that, for any organization to succeed with the diversity efforts, they have to make sure their leadership are on board. It's the same with any kind of transformation journey that you go on. So obviously working in software, I can relate. But unless you have the buy-in from both the leadership and the team, it's an incredibly hard journey. So I really do believe I could talk to you about this for hours, Kay, but I'm very aware of time. So firstly, I want to say thank you so much for sharing your passion for diversity and your knowledge around the research. And I personally have taken a lot away from today, and I hope, and I'm sure our listeners have as well. If anyone would like to learn more about your work and what you're doing, what is the best place to find you, and to find out more about your book as well?
So first of all, Hannah, I have so enjoyed your questions, so thank you for that. And there are a number of areas where you could learn more. As Hannah mentioned, I have brought all this 35 years of experience and research, more than 50 organizations in a book, which you mentioned, which is called Beyond D&I, Leading Diversity with Purpose and Inclusiveness. And there is a site which is called Beyond Diversity and Inclusion.com. And all the models that I talked about is within that site, and the book as well.
Wonderful. So for those that are listening, I would encourage you to obviously look at that site. We will pop the links into the show notes. I want to thank you again, Kay, for your passionate support of diversity, and for sharing that knowledge with us, because I think there's a huge amount that we can all learn at all stages of organization, all teams can, about changing our inclusion policy. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much. And thank you to your listeners for listening.